Today, we're going to talk about the architect of a world that, let's be honest, has completely dominated pop culture for over a decade. His stories of dragons, knights, and some seriously brutal politics have hooked millions. This is the story of the man behind the Iron Throne, George R.R. Martin. So right off the bat, you have to understand the scale of his impact. Even before the TV show became this global monster, critics were already putting him in the same league as the father of modern fantasy himself. I mean, that is a huge, huge statement about his place in literature. And look, that title, The American Tolkien, it isn't just some catchy headline. It really signals a fundamental shift that he brought to the fantasy genre. His influence just kept growing and growing until his power as a storyteller was recognized all over the world. Okay, so you've got the critical praise, you've got the global influence, but the real question is, how did a guy from Bayonne, New Jersey reach these incredible heights? Well, to figure that out, we've got to go back to the very beginning. You know, every epic story has an origin, and Martin starts in a world far, far smaller than the one he would eventually build. The seeds of Westeros were actually planted in the housing projects of post-war America. This contrast right here is absolutely key to understanding him. Martin's entire childhood world was confined to just a few city blocks. And as this kid who just devoured books, his only real escape was his imagination. That very limitation, that feeling of being cooped up, became the fuel for creating one of the most massive fictional worlds ever. And you can see his signature style forming even when he was a kid. He had this little kingdom for his pet turtles, right? But when they started dying, he didn't just accept it. No, he imagined they were killing each other off in sinister plots. Betrayal, murder, high-stakes drama, it was all right there from the very beginning, just happening inside a toy castle. Now, here's a twist. While everyone compares him to Tolkien, Martin himself points to Marvel Comics. And that gives you this huge insight. His characters aren't these perfect, shiny archetypes. They're flawed, they're conflicted, they're deeply human, just like the heroes Stan Lee was famous for creating. It grounds his work in a much more modern, character-first kind of storytelling. And he wasn't just some casual fan either. He was a pioneer of the entire culture. I mean, he bought the very first ticket to the first ever Comic-Con, wrote for fanzines, connected with other fans. He understood this world from the inside out way before he became one of its biggest icons. So all of this passion eventually builds into a professional career, but before he ever forged the Iron Throne, his path took this major detour, one that came from a really crushing failure that almost made him quit writing novels for good. After some early success, Martin poured everything he had into this book, a really complex horror novel about a 60s rock band. He had huge hopes for it, but commercially, it was a total disaster. It flopped. Hard. Just think about that for a second. The man who would go on to write A Game of Thrones was so completely devastated by this one failure that he was seriously ready to give up writing novels and go sell houses. The entire world of Westeros was just hanging by a thread. So with his novel writing career pretty much dead, he pivoted to Hollywood. And for almost a decade, he wrote for television, and he was good at it, finding success on popular shows. But while TV kind of saved his career, a whole new kind of frustration started to build up. See, the very thing that saved his career, television, became this creative cage. He had these huge, epic ideas, but he was constantly being told, no, it's too expensive, it's too big, there are too many characters. And that constant frustration, well, that would become the spark for his masterpiece. So after years and years of being told what he couldn't write, Martin decided to write something just for himself, something with no limits, no budget, and zero compromises. A story that was as big as he could possibly imagine it. He went back to his love of history and fantasy, drawing inspiration from these brutal English civil wars called the Wars of the Roses. And he just started writing a new novel, one where he could have all the characters, all the castles, and all the dragons he ever wanted. But he wasn't just writing another fantasy novel. He was actively rebelling against the whole genre. He totally rejected what he called the Disneyland Middle Ages. You know, that clean, simple, good versus evil fantasy that was so popular. Instead, he wanted grit, he wanted moral ambiguity, and a deep, deep focus on the internal struggles of his characters. He basically became the face of a new subgenre, grimdark. If Tolkien represents this idealized, heroic version of fantasy, Martin represents its dark, cynical, and brutally realistic cousin. He wasn't just the American Tolkien. In a lot of ways, he was the anti-Tolkien. And as it turns out, the world was more than ready for this new, darker vision of fantasy. What began as this personal project, just a reaction to creative frustration, would go on to completely conquer the entire landscape of global pop culture. First, the books built an empire all on their own long before the show. The fifth book, A Dance with Dragons, was a complete juggernaut. We're talking 88 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. That's almost 2 years. It proved he had already built this massive kingdom of devoted readers. Then, HBO entered the game. The adaptation, Game of Thrones, became a phenomenon. By its 4th season, it was averaging a staggering 18.4 million viewers an episode. That made it the most watched series in HBO history and turned a beloved book series into a genuine global cultural event. And it all comes back to him, the boy from Bayonne whose world was just 5 streets long, the comic fan who bought the very first ticket to Comic-Con, the failed novelist who almost started selling real estate, the frustrated TV writer who finally wrote a story with no limits. All of it led to this man and the unparalleled world he created. So his place in the literary pantheon is secure. He changed fantasy forever. But as millions of fans know all too well, the song isn't over yet. The final books are still unwritten. And so the ultimate question remains, for the man who built a world on shocking twists and devastating conclusions, what will his final chapter truly be?